Welcome to the 3 Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. 3 Martinis coming up.
Sad to say they're all crazy, but something tells me you're probably not all that surprised, given the news of the past 24 hours. Jim, we've already had the emergency break on the stock market today, which is also not a big surprise. Stocks sharply down again. Last I checked here late morning, the Dow was down around 8%. We're officially in bear market territory, and polls show that Americans are more worried about the financial impact than the impact on their health, and obviously both are of concern. The president addressed the nation last night. This is Martini number 1. I think those of us who present were taken aback fairly early on by the presentation. The president seemed to rush it a little bit. There were times he seemed to maybe not know where the sentence ended, gulped a couple words. But the most important thing is the content, obviously. And the president had a lot of news in this speech. One of the biggest ones, of course, was the 30-day travel ban on Europe starting at the end of this week. So here is that clip, as well as what he said after it, which gets us into our real crazy martini, which is the president ended up saying several things in this speech which had to be clarified because they weren't exactly true.
To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight. These restrictions will be adjusted subject to conditions on the ground. There will be exemptions for Americans who have undergone appropriate screenings, and these prohibitions will not only apply to the tremendous amount of trade and cargo, but various other things as we get approval. Anything coming from Europe to the United States is what we are discussing. These restrictions will also not apply to the United Kingdom.
So there's a couple things in that one. First of all, he made it sound like there would be no cargo coming from Europe to the United States. The policy is that cargo will still, in fact, come. And he also said, Jim, that there will be exemptions for Americans who have undergone appropriate screenings. But as you point out in today's Morning Jolt, that's not the case for folks coming from a lot of different countries in Europe. Finally, he said later on in the speech that he met with leaders of the health insurance industry, which is probably true. But he said they have agreed to waive all co-payments for coronavirus treatments. Turns out that's only true about coronavirus testing, not treatments. They put out statements to clarify all this. I don't know exactly what the impact of the flubs in the speech will be, but it would have been good to get this right the first time.
Yeah, none of this is reassuring. I suppose if you want to argue that the first example of him announcing something that wasn't accurate wasn't really wrong, he makes two statements which seem to be, one seems very sweeping, and then he talks about the exemptions. We will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days. The new rules will go into effect Friday at midnight. Well, people think, wow, all travel from Europe, that would seem to mean everybody. A few moments later, he says there will be exemptions for Americans who have undergone appropriate screenings. Well, if you're leaving exemptions for Americans, then you're not really meaning all travel. And then you look at the actual order from the Department of Homeland Security. It's the entry of foreign nationals. And by the way, it's not just people who are European citizens. It is if you have been in certain European citizens, basically all the EU countries. Now, the good news is if you're an American who's overseas, and apparently last night there was this mad rush to the airport as all Americans in Europe who are on vacation or studying abroad or in the country for business or something, all did everything they could to get back as quickly as they could. U.S. citizens, their family members, legal permanent residents, and unspecified certain other individuals can come back, but they have to go through certain select airports. And at least as of when I wrote the Jolt this morning, and I've not heard since then, which airports those would be. I assume it would be all of our big international airports, your LaGuardias and JFKs, your Dulles, probably your Hartsfield, O'Hare, all the ones where you get a lot of direct flights from Europe. My guess is that's where it's going to be. But, you're given an address on Wednesday night. The policy goes into effect Friday. It gives you a day to iron out all the details here. Oh, by the way, apparently most European leaders were given no warning of this whatsoever. And I think that is another, you probably don't want to start, making these big sweeping policy changes on the fly. You want to get coordination and buy-in from as many people as possible. The statement about a cargo, again, he's not vague in what he says there. These prohibitions will not, I almost wonder if it was supposed to say these prohibitions will not apply to the amount of trade and cargo. I know what was on the teleprompter, but the president said these prohibitions will not only apply to the tremendous amount of trade and cargo, but various other things as we get approval. Now, about an hour later, the president goes onto Twitter and says, trade will in no way be affected by the 30-day restriction of travel from Europe. The restriction stops people, not goods. The president should not have to jump onto social media an hour later and say, oh, what I just said, the policy is actually going to be the opposite of it. And the third one, as you mentioned, was the major leaders of health insurance industry. Correct. They said they would waive co-payments for coronavirus testing. And that's good. And, for most people, that's the only expense related to coronavirus they're probably going to have. The bad news is some people are going to have treatment. That treatment could be very expensive. It's going to mean a trip to the ICU, et cetera. And Americans' health insurance plans have said no, they've not agreed to that. I'm a little bit baffled as to how errors like this get into a speech being given from the Oval Office during the time of a global pandemic. This is really piss poor staff work. I suppose you could put some of this on the president. The president hired all these people. But the president, I assume he's not fact-checking what's being said in front of him. I assume he's been in the meeting when they're formulating these policies and things like that. But it is absolutely baffling that an Oval Office address could have 3 significant errors in describing what the government is going to do, because pretty much the whole point of the Oval Office address. The second thing that's jumping to mind, just when you play that audio there, Greg, I wonder if the president has been tested. First of all, this was very low energy Trump. Look, he's probably exhausted. This is probably the most stressful moment of his presidency. It could be just a routine, cold or under the weather. Could be allergies. Could be a whole bunch of things. But between apparently the Brazilian president is being tested. One of his staffers was there. He met the Brazilian president a couple of days ago. Look, the president of the United States runs into lots of people all the time. I think testing the president seems like a reasonable precaution at this moment. If the test comes back negative, nothing to worry about. If the test does not come back negative, then we got to start taking care of this pretty seriously. Our plate is full. I don't want to deal with a sick president in the middle of all this stuff. So I hope everything's going to improve and turn around. But that was a really frustrating moment from the White House last night.
Yeah, and obviously he's very busy. Seems like a couple of run-throughs might have been good on that presentation last night. You mentioned, Jim, what you thought that his lower energy might have meant. Other folks thought it meant a more somber tone, which is appropriate. In fact, one of the president's most unlikely defenders last night on cable news was his 2016 rival, John Kasich, who is still no fan of Trump. But given that Don Lemon was completely flying off the handle last night, John Kasich came through as what qualifies for the voice of reason on CNN.
I'm trying to say to you, Don, we got to move down the road. Looking back doesn't get things fixed.
We're not looking back. The president's address was tonight. That is the newest information.
I think his address tonight
is the president's address.
I think it was fine. That's what I think.
You think inaccurate information that you have to come back and clarify 2 or 3 times, you think that's fine?
Look, I thought he did fine. That's what I thought. I thought he had the right tone, and he no longer played around with, we're going to blame Democrats or forget this stuff. I hope he's trying to move forward because he understands the seriousness of this situation. Now, the fact that they clarified, it isn't unusual in a speech for somebody to clarify something, okay?
Wow. Jim, John Kasich defending the president. Better mark that day down in history.
Yeah. I haven't seen Don Lemon this upset since the black hole took in the Malaysian airliner. We've been complaining about partisanship and shout fests on cable news for a long time right now. One of the big issues that we've seen the last couple of days is calling it the Wuhan virus is racist and xenophobic. And, the president referred to this as a foreign virus, like it's indigenous or something. I wonder if some people turn to that almost as a balm, almost as something to reassure themselves, because what we're dealing with right now is really scary. And yelling at someone that they're racist probably feels better. Yelling at someone that they used the term Wuhan virus instead of coronavirus, and thus they are, demonizing Asian Americans or something like that. That makes them feel a lot better. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez probably doesn't have much that can be useful in a moment like this, but she can claim other people refusing to order Chinese food is racist. Yeah, thank you, AOC. That's very helpful at this moment.
All right, well, let's move on to our second crazy martini now, Jim, because anytime America is in a stressful situation, one of the best things that we have is our ability to escape with being able to focus on things that aren't so serious, like sports. Oh, wait. The NCAA tournament, as we speak anyway, announced on Wednesday that the tournament for both the men and the women, college basketball, is going to go forward with no fans in the stands other than essential personnel and certain family members. You got Jason Williams, now goes by Jay Williams, on ESPN today saying the NCAA should just cancel the whole tournament. But, you know, he went to Duke, so he's used to being wrong. We'll see how this ends up going in terms of the pressure. But there's going to be more pressure on the NCAA and Major League Baseball. Oh, by the way, the Mariners have canceled all their home games for April already because of the virus being in and around the Seattle area. The NHL is looking at this carefully, and now the NBA suspending the season as of last night because one of their players, Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz, has tested positive for the virus. In fact, the game he was in against the Oklahoma City Thunder last night was called just a few minutes before tip-off. Here's CBS reporter Dana Jacobson, formerly of ESPN, explaining the story.
And you see the teams heading back to the locker room.
Just before tip-off in Oklahoma City's packed Chesapeake Energy Arena, referees huddled on the court as players were told to return to their locker rooms.
The game tonight has been postponed.
Shocking news for the NBA. Utah Jazz center Rudy Gobert had tested positive for coronavirus. Just 3 days ago, he jokingly grabbed microphones at a press conference, poking fun at the NBA media policies, which had required reporters to stay at least 6 feet away from players. Shortly after the game was canceled, the NBA announced the suspension of the season.
And we don't know when it'll come back. They certainly hope to have it back, and they certainly hope to have a postseason. Obviously, a lot of money on the line here, Jim, but when you've got a player testing positive, you assume that they're going to force him into the self-quarantine. And if one team has to do that, it's not really fair for the other teams to have to play that team at that point. So it makes sense on a fairness level, but you have to wonder just where this cancellation is going to end here, whether it goes to the NCAA tournament. You've got, I don't know, dozens at least, it seems, universities now sending all the students home for the rest of the semester, extended spring breaks, online learning. We'll see what extent that actually consists of for the next few months. But it's affected a lot of different areas of life now. It's not just where you think it's going to hit. It's hitting everywhere.
Yeah. As we are speaking, Greg, Major League Soccer has announced that it is suspending its season. Because of the seriousness, I'm going to spare the usual joke. Nobody watches soccer. If you're a soccer fan, I'm sure you're sad and frustrated by what's going on here. My summary of the Morning Jolt today was last night was a long year.
Right.
It felt like every couple of minutes, some rather significant development was coming across your social media feed or television. Right as I was putting the boys to bed, I got reports of people saying something odd was going on at the Jazz game, that things had not started on time and there was no explanation of what was going on. And I put out a little GIF image of the X-Files, something mysterious is happening. Well, apparently they found out that he was positive like right before tip-off. I mean, the ball was in the ref's hands. 5 players from each team were on the court. They were ready to go. Team doctor runs in and says, this is testing positive. And I believe I saw right before we logged on, Greg, that one of his teammates has also caught the coronavirus. You can't have guys sweating over each other and bodies bumping into each other and inhaling and exhaling very rapidly, face to face in circumstances like this. This feels like it's just a sequence of dominoes. I don't know if the NCAA tournament is going to go on, because the NBA is just, as we just said, the Major League Soccer, my understanding is that National Hockey League is having a meeting today. They're going to evaluate this. The idea of all of us having to self-quarantine and avoid large gatherings and all that stuff looked somewhat manageable if we were going to get March Madness and if things were going to go on. We'd, stay home like couch potatoes and watch our sports and Netflix our things instead of going to the movies. And, it'd be like a extra week of spring break or an extra week of sick days. We just kind of hang around for a bit. This would be manageable. This is starting to look a lot more serious, a lot more frustrating. I think, the sports leagues are in the same situation we are, kind of feeling their way through this, trying to figure out how to calculate just what behaviors are high risk and which ones are acceptable risk. I just want to say, Greg, it's a really weird set of circumstances when you feel like you're getting more information about breaking news on a public health crisis from ESPN than you are from CNN.
Jim, I know we're not supposed to politicize the virus, but is there any sort of poetic irony that China ruined the beginning of the NBA season and now is destroying the end of it?
Yeah, maybe they won't like China now.
All right. Well, let's move on to our final crazy martini now, also related to the coronavirus, because, again, last night, breaking news, we got a statement from Tom Hanks and his wife, Rita Wilson. They're in Australia doing pre-production for a movie about Elvis. I think Tom Hanks is playing Colonel Tom Parker and that sort of thing. But anyway, that's not the point. He says, "Hello, folks. Rita and I are down here in Australia. We felt a bit tired, like we had colds and some body aches. Rita had some chills that came and went, slight fevers too. To play things right, as is needed in the world right now, we were tested for the coronavirus and were found to be positive. Well, now, what to do next? The medical officials have protocols that must be followed. We Hanks will be tested, observed, and isolated for as long as public health and safety requires." And so, Jim, this is interesting on a number of levels. First of all, they're not in the United States. They're in Australia, which we know has had previous cases. It also tells us that you don't have to feel like you just got run over by a Mack truck and you can't get out of bed to have this. So it reminds us that a lot of people are going to have fairly mild versions of this, which is going to make folks really antsy about deciding to stay down when they aren't feeling that crummy.
Right? I mean, this is generally spring allergy season. Depending on where you are in the country, the pollen is starting to, bloom. Usually at this time of year, you're going to get a lot of people are going to get ordinary colds and sniffles and stuff like that. And everybody's going to be thinking, what if this is something much more serious? By the way, apparently, just as we're speaking, just an update to what we were talking about a moment ago, it's now coming across. The NHL is likely to announce they're suspending the season later this afternoon.
This is the breaking news 3 martini lunch. This is incredible.
Well, this thing is happening so darn fast. Anyway, regarding Tom Hanks, again, because of his performances over the years, there are probably lots of Americans, even if they've never met Tom Hanks, feel like they know him. Feel like they have they feel like he's their friend. He always seems like a nice guy in his acceptance speeches and so on. And as one person said, "Oh, well, wait a second. If Tom Hanks got this, we're going to find a cure to this in about a month." I don't think things are going to shake out that way. It'd be wonderful if it did. Look, the chances are Tom Hanks, I looked it up. He's, probably in his late 50s, but he'll probably be fine. He's going to get the best care. I think the odd thing is the possibility of 2 Jazz players having this. Tom and Rita Wilson. There's a Maria Cantwell staffer. All the different people who are coming up positive, who are thankfully not being hospitalized in the ICU and not having a terrible set of circumstances, who don't know, who are not, haven't been to Wuhan recently, haven't been traipsing through Italy, that suggests this is floating around a lot, and that is both bad news and that is both good news. It is bad news for everyone who's trying to self-quarantine. It is, the possibility that you've already interacted with someone who has the virus is now not outside the realm of possibility. Again, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV. Consult your doctor and other stuff. But we have this. There's a chance it's out there. Now, if it's out there and most people are having very minor symptoms or no symptoms, well, that's a good sign. That's a sign that we are. Most people are going to get this. They're not going to have it and all that stuff. Bad news is they could very well be sharing it to people who are immunocompromised or who are elderly or who are going to be in a set of circumstances. I feel like this is a day of decision. I think the state of the country at the beginning of the week and the state of the country at the end of the week are just going to be completely different places. And I think we have to, we're just going to take it day by day, adjust as needed. We will get through this. It's just, we're probably in for a spring that none of us are ever going to forget.
That's probably right. I'm just wondering if people are going to come to the conclusion that, look, no matter what precautions we take, it's still going around, and for most people it's not that bad. And business owners, particularly those who have employees that can't functionally telework, depending on what the business might be, are going to conclude that all of the precautions aren't necessarily going to be required, and if people's bottom lines are truly headed towards the dumper here, that's going to be a factor here too. It's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah. Interesting is one word for it. Isn't it a Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times?
It is. It's always the Chinese.
Yes.
China. Jim, we'll see what tomorrow holds. Talk to you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos, Radio America. Thanks very much for being with us today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Please leave us a kind review. And join us again Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.